Welcome to our screencast on a text-based approach to planning close reading. My name is Emily Hofer, and I'm the Managing Director of Literacy Professional Learning at ANET. The objective of this screencast is for you to become familiar with a text-centered approach to planning close reading instruction. Before watching this screencast, you should have a basic understanding of text complexity, close reading, and text-dependent questions. If you need a refresher, please watch our other screencasts on these topics. Our intended audience for this screencast is any teacher or leader with this background knowledge who is interested in learning more about this approach to planning. Our content is most applicable to those who teach or support grades 2 through 8. On your screen, you're seeing an outline of this planning approach. We will walk through each step with an example during this screencast. Whenever you see this screen during the screencast, you can click to another step in the approach based on what you'd most like to learn about. We'll begin by considering the texts we'll use for instruction. If we're going to ask students and teachers to spend this much time digging into a text, it needs to be a text worth reading. It should also be a brief text, for example, an excerpt from a novel or a short article. In this screencast, we'll be working with a poem called The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. It's listed in Common Core Appendix B as an exemplar for grades 4 to 5. So it's brief, a poem, and as a Common Core exemplar, we can feel confident it's both high quality and complex. Now that we have our text, let's talk about the next piece of this planning approach, which can be summed up as know the text. On your screen, you're seeing the text of the New Colossus poem. You have a choice here. Either pause your screencast now to read this text, or click on the pop-up on your screen to access the text of this poem, print it out, and conduct a close read on your own. I encourage you to print it out and annotate as you do a close read if you are able. Now that you've familiarized yourself with the text, we're going to be getting to know it even more deeply through a qualitative analysis. Remember that there are 3 dimensions of text complexity, but we're just going to be digging into the qualitative dimension right now. Here you're seeing a visual representation of the qualitative elements of text complexity: meaning or purpose, structure, language, and knowledge. Pause your screencast now to refresh your memory on each of these elements. So now we want to consider the questions you see on your screen. First, what are the key understandings of the text that students should take away? Next, what qualitative aspects would make comprehending these key understandings challenging? Specifically, what about the meaning or purpose, structure, language, and knowledge will students potentially struggle with? Now I'll share my thinking about the New Colossus. The key understanding I'd want students to walk away with is that the New Colossus, or Statue of Liberty, was a symbol of welcome and freedom for newcomers to the United States. In terms of what would make getting to this key understanding challenging, here are my thoughts about the qualitative complexity of the text along each of the 4 dimensions we discussed a moment ago. Pause your screencast now to read the qualitative analysis of the poem. You'll notice that I thought the meaning and language of the poem would be most challenging for students to grapple with to arrive at the key understanding at the top of the slide. Now let's move on to writing a focusing question and statement. A focusing question sets a succinct purpose for the lesson. It outlines what students should be able to answer in writing as a culminating task and will shape the lesson to get students to that point. Having a focusing question aligns with best practice in backwards planning for instruction. If we know our destination, it will allow us to make smart decisions about how to get our students there. So now let's talk about how to write a focusing question. Since you've practiced naming a key understanding from the text, this is actually very straightforward. Let's look at the key understanding that we identified from the New Colossus. We said that the key thing for students to be able to understand from this text was that the New Colossus, or Statue of Liberty, was a symbol of welcome and freedom for newcomers to the United States. From here, we simply need to transpose this key understanding into a question that we want students to answer in writing at the end of the series of lessons. So I might rework this key understanding into a focusing question as you see on your screen. What is the New Colossus and what does it represent? Again, this question sets a clear purpose for our lesson. It outlines what students should be able to answer in writing as the culminating task and will help shape our lesson to get to that point. In their book, Writing for Understanding, the Vermont Writing Collaborative has given further guidance about focusing questions. Pause your screencast now to read their recommendations. So you can see that a great deal is up to a teacher's judgment in writing a focusing question, but the decision should be informed by his or her students, the curriculum, as well as the text and content being taught. Now you'll want to create a focusing statement, the answer to your focusing question that you want students to generate in writing themselves at the end of your series of lessons as the thesis for their writing. Again, if you begin with the end in mind, you'll be able to plan a cohesive lesson that drives toward that endpoint. So for this example, our focusing statement might be, the new Colossus or Statue of Liberty was a symbol of welcome and freedom for newcomers to the United States. Notice how our previous work to uncover the text's key understanding made crafting the focusing question and statement straightforward. In fact, the key understanding can directly translate into your focusing statement, and you can see that they're identical in this example. Now let's move on to creating text-dependent questions. Once you have your focusing questions, you'll want your text-dependent questions to scaffold up towards students being able to answer that big question about the text. Your focusing questions should serve as your North Star as you draft your text-dependent questions. These questions will drive your close reading approach and advance students' ability to write about the focusing question. This approach will help you keep focused on the most important elements of the text to ask questions about, rather than drafting endless lists of text-dependent questions that you could ask students during a lesson. One final tip, don't forget the work you did in your qualitative analysis. We want to make sure that your questions also target difficult portions of the text as uncovered through your analysis. On your screen, you're seeing some sample text-dependent questions that could be used to help students make meaning of difficult sections of the new Colossus text. Pause your screencast now to think through how you might sequence these questions toward being able to answer the focusing question. There's more than one right way to do this, but to give you an example, I'll share my thinking with you on how I might sequence the questions if I were to teach this lesson. Pause your screencast now to take a look at this example and consider how you thought about scaffolding these questions similarly or differently. You'll notice that in this example, I started out with more literal questions that would help students first identify that the poem is referring to the Statue of Liberty before moving on to ask a series of questions digging into the language of the poem that would help students then answer the question that's more abstract about what the Statue of Liberty represents. You can see another way to think about the connection between a focusing question and the text-dependent questions in a series of lessons through the graphic on the screen. You can think about your overarching focusing question as the top of the mountain, and the text-dependent questions that you ask students to answer during each lesson get you closer and closer over time toward being able to answer that focusing question. To sum up, here again are the steps we just walked through to plan a basic text-centered close reading lesson. I encourage you to practice this approach with the text you plan to use in upcoming instruction. To plan this way does take time, but we've seen that with continued practice, both leaders and teachers become more adept and efficient with this approach. Thanks for joining us for this screencast.